Imagine walking through a quiet, snowy street and suddenly discovering a little girl, shivering, clutching a baby in her arms, with only a German shepherd standing guard. What would you do in that moment? Today's story will take you on a journey of courage, sacrifice, and the kind of love that changes lives forever. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments, I'd love to know. And may this story bless your heart. Have a truly wonderful day. The mountain town of Pinewood in Oregon woke beneath a cold October morning. A hush laid over the streets as though the earth itself had pulled a blanket of silence against its chest. Frost rimmed the wooden fences and the faded paint of clapboard houses, smoke curled from a few chimneys, and the air smelled of damp pine, mixed with the metallic bite of approaching winter. The streets were nearly empty, only the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting across a roof, or the lonely sweep of a gust chasing dry leaves down the gutter. Officer Ethan Cole stepped out of his patrol car and drew in the sting of the air. At 35, Ethan had the look of a man who had walked too long with ghosts. His frame was broad, though his posture carried a weight that bent his shoulders forward, as if grief itself had chosen to ride on his back. His brown hair, once carefully combed, was now kept short only for convenience, not pride. His eyes, a faded blue, seemed to always carry storm clouds, not because of the weather, but because of what he had lost. 2 years earlier, his wife had died in a car accident that left him cradling their infant daughter, who did not survive the crash. That night had left a scar carved deeper than any wound to his skin. Since then, he had buried himself in work, patrolling Pinewood's narrow streets not to protect himself from danger, but to guard himself from memory. Beside him padded Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd, a dog whose black and silver coat caught the first pale light as the sun fought to rise over the ridge. Ranger's chest was deep, his ears pointed like sentinels, and his eyes were sharp, filled with a loyalty that seemed carved from stone. He had been Ethan's partner since his first year on the force, and in many ways Ranger had been the only reason Ethan had not drowned completely in the tides of grief. Unlike humans, Ranger demanded nothing but presence. He was watchful, fiercely protective, with a habit of tilting his head whenever Ethan's voice grew low, as if he could sense the undertow of despair and was reminding him to keep walking. That morning, Ethan had driven the familiar loop past Pinewood's small row of shops and the modest houses tucked into the hillside. The town was quiet, but something about the air felt unsettled, as if silence itself had thickened. He closed the cruiser door, his boots crunching over frost, and that was when he heard it, the sound that made his spine stiffen. A cry, not the kind of tantrum-laced wailing of a spoiled child, but a thin, trembling sound, fragile and haunting. Ethan froze, his years of training pulling him taut like a wire. Ranger lifted his head, ears forward, body angled in alert. The sound came again, muffled, from the narrow alley between two houses where garbage bins lined the wall. Ethan's hand drifted to his belt out of instinct, though there was no threat, only uncertainty. Ranger moved forward first, paws careful but certain, sniffing. The air. Ethan followed, his breath fogging the air in soft clouds. And then he saw her. A girl no older than 6, her tangled black hair matted against her cheeks, wearing a sweater that had once been pink but was now dulled by grime and frayed at the sleeves. Her jeans hung loose, cuffed above sneakers that had lost their laces. Her face was thin, skin pale beneath the dirt smudges, and her eyes, large, brown, shimmering with both fear and stubbornness, snapped upward the instant she noticed the officer and the towering dog. Strapped against her chest with a faded blue blanket was a baby, small and frail, whose weak cries cut into the morning air like the rustling of dry paper. The child's skin was flushed with fever, his little hands curling and uncurling in restless discomfort. In the girl's other hand was a plastic bag filled with bottles and cans, clutched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. For a moment, her body stiffened as if she might run, but the weight of the infant and her own exhaustion made escape impossible. Ethan crouched slowly, lowering his voice, softening the edges of his authority. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, his tone as gentle as the air was sharp. "Are you okay?" The girl froze, her bottom lip trembling. Her gaze flicked to Ranger, whose body was tense but whose eyes held no malice, only watchful curiosity. Ethan noted how the dog, as if understanding the delicate balance, slowly sat down, ears alert but posture calm. When the girl finally spoke, it was little more than a whisper carried by the autumn air. Please, please don't take my brother away. I'm taking good care of him. I promise. The words pierced Ethan deeper than any blade. His mind, unbidden, conjured the image of his own daughter, lost forever. And here was this child, so impossibly small, standing between her baby brother and the world, carrying a burden far beyond her years. He forced the ache back down his throat and asked gently, "What's your name?" The girl adjusted the blanket that bound the infant tighter to her chest, her chin lifting with the fragile pride of someone who refused to break. "Mika," she said, voice steadier this time, "and this is Noah. He's sick, but I'm going to make him better. Yesterday I found some food, and I gave him all the good parts." Ethan's heart clenched at the innocence of the declaration. The girl's hands, raw from cold, clutched the baby as though she were both mother and sister, protector and provider. The determination in her voice reminded Ethan of the raw, stubborn defiance of a soldier refusing surrender. But she was only 6 years old. Ranger shifted, lowering his head closer to Mika as if offering assurance. For the first time since Ethan had stepped into the alley, Mika's eyes softened. She reached out her free hand and brushed her fingers against Ranger's fur, tentative but desperate for something warm and alive to hold on to. Ranger leaned into the touch, his steady breathing like an anchor against the cold. Ethan swallowed the knot in his throat. The morning air seemed colder, heavier, but he forced his voice steady. "Mika," he said, "you've been so brave, and I promise, no one is going to take your brother away. But we need to get him somewhere safe. He's sick, and he needs help." Mika's gaze searched his face, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then she looked at Ranger again, and something in her small body seemed to relent. She nodded, only once, her eyes still bright with unshed tears. Ethan extended his hand, not to take anything from her, but simply to offer. Mika hesitated, then adjusted Noah's weight and slipped her tiny fingers into his gloved palm. Ethan closed his hand gently around hers, steady and sure. Ranger rose to his feet, walking beside them as Ethan guided Mika and Noah out of the alley and toward the cruiser. For the first time that morning, Pinewood's silence no longer felt empty. It felt expectant, as if the town itself knew that something had begun, something far greater than a simple patrol, something that would test Ethan's fractured faith in justice and family, and perhaps offer him a chance at healing he had long thought lost. And as Noah whimpered softly, his frail voice muffled by the blanket, Ethan vowed silently that this would not be the end of the children's story. It was only the beginning. The police station of Pinewood was a modest brick building, 2 stories high, with ivy creeping along one wall that autumn had painted in shades of crimson and gold. It stood at the edge of Main Street, a place where small-town disputes and great personal tragedies often found their first moment of reckoning. That morning, as Ethan Cole guided Mika and the bundled infant into its quiet halls, the warmth inside struck him like a wave after the chill outside. The hum of old radiators filled the space, mingling with the smell of coffee brewed too long. Behind the reception desk, a young officer lifted his head, eyes widening at the sight of a 6-year-old clutching a baby, her hair tangled, her sweater thin and stained. Ethan gave a brief nod that silenced questions, his tone sharp from habit, but laced with a rare gentleness. "Clear a room." The officer obeyed immediately, unlocking the small interview room at the far end of the corridor. Mika hesitated as they entered, her small frame tense, eyes darting to every corner as though expecting the walls themselves might swallow her brother. She clutched Noah tighter, and his faint cough filled the silence. Ranger padded in behind them, tail low, ears flicking at every sound. Ethan crouched near Mika and whispered, "You're safe here. No one will hurt you." His voice carried the kind of firmness that came not just from training, but from a man who knew what it meant to promise safety and fail. A knock on the door interrupted. When it opened, a woman stepped inside. She was not dressed in uniform, but in a dark cardigan layered over a pale blouse, her hair pulled back neatly, glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She carried a leather folder tucked under one arm and a thermos in her hand. Clara Jennings, 31 years old, had the look of someone who had learned to listen before speaking. Her height was unremarkable, her build lean, but what struck most about her was the gravity in her eyes, hazel with golden flecks, eyes that gave the impression she had seen every form of brokenness and never turned away. Clara was Pinewood's county-assigned social worker, known among locals as a woman both relentless and compassionate. Raised herself in the foster system after her mother abandoned her at a bus station, Clara carried in her heart a vow never to let children feel forgotten, if she could help it. That history had carved her into someone who approached each case not as paperwork, but as a wound that demanded careful hands. To her, every child carried a story, and she believed those stories deserved to be protected, even when the world turned cruel. Ethan introduced her quietly. "Mika, this is Clara. She helps families." Mika's shoulders stiffened, mistrust flashing in her dark eyes. Clara did not move closer immediately. Instead, she knelt down at a respectful distance, placed her folder aside, and unscrewed the lid of her thermos. Steam curled upward, carrying the scent of chamomile. "Would you like some warm tea?" she asked softly. Her voice had the quality of a lullaby that did not demand but offered. Mika glanced down at Noah, then shook her head, hugging him tighter. Clara nodded, not offended. "That's all right. Maybe later." For several minutes, Clara let silence do its work. She observed the girl, the way her thin arms trembled from the effort of holding Noah, the way she positioned herself slightly turned, as if to shield him from everyone else. Clara knew that stance. It was the same posture she had once carried when she was 12, trying to guard her younger foster sister from the chaos of a violent household. That memory pressed into her, reminding her that children learn survival faster than they should. Finally, Clara spoke again, gently but with direction. "Mika, can you tell me about you and your brother?" The child blinked, wary, but perhaps softened by the tone. "His name is Noah," she whispered. "He's sick. I found a place behind the big store where the trucks come. It was dry when it rained. I gave him food I found." She swallowed hard, her voice breaking under weight no 6-year-old should carry. "Mama went away to work. Daddy said he'd come back, but it's been—" She frowned, her small fingers twitching as she counted. "Lots of days." Ethan, leaning against the wall, felt his chest tighten. The phrase "lots of days" carried more weight than calendars ever could. Clara's hand stilled on the table, her eyes glistening, though her voice remained steady. "And you've been caring for Noah all this time?" Mika nodded fiercely, lifting her chin with a pride born from necessity. "I give him everything. Even when I was hungry, he needed it more." At that, Ranger, lying near the door, lifted his head and let out a low, soft whine, as though the dog himself mourned the burden this child had carried. Mika turned her eyes to him, and for the first time since arriving at the station, a tiny smile brushed her lips. She reached one hand down, brushing her fingers through the coarse black and silver fur. Ranger leaned forward, pressing his head gently into her palm. Clara saw the exchange and felt her heart lurch. Sometimes trust was not given to words, but to creatures who could not lie. Clara reached carefully into her folder and slid a pack of crackers across the table. "You must be hungry too," she said. Mika eyed them, but shook her head again. "Noah first." Clara did not argue, only smiled softly. "That's love," she murmured. "But you're important too, Mika. For Noah to be okay, you have to be okay." Silence held the room for a moment, broken only by the weak sounds of Noah's breathing. Ethan, arms crossed, watched both women, the girl and the social worker, as if seeing a bridge being built between them, one that even his authority could not command. In Clara's presence, Mika was still wary, but her trembling lessened, the stiffness in her small frame loosening slightly. Ethan realized with a pang that what Clara offered was something he could not, a gentleness rooted not in law, but in lived wounds. When Clara finally looked back at Ethan, her eyes spoke volumes. This child was not just another case, she was a survivor, and survivors, Clara knew, could crumble if the world pushed too hard. They needed steady hands to remind them they were not alone. As the morning light shifted through the blinds, falling in stripes across the room, Clara asked softly, "Mika, would you let me hold Noah just for a moment? I want to make sure he's breathing okay." Mika froze, her lips pressing tight. She looked at Ethan, then at Ranger, who seemed to nod in his silent way by staying utterly calm. Mika hesitated, then slowly, carefully, she shifted the bundle of faded blanket into Clara's waiting arms. Clara cradled Noah with practiced grace, her fingers gentle as she brushed back the fabric. The infant's skin was warm with fever, his breathing shallow but steady. Clara's throat tightened, but she spoke with optimism. "We're going to get him help right away. You've done an amazing job, Mika. Truly, you kept him alive." Mika's eyes shimmered at the words, her chest heaving once as if releasing weeks of pent-up fear. She whispered, barely audible, "I tried." Clara smiled, a rare smile that broke through the heaviness in her face. "You didn't just try, you succeeded, and now we'll help you carry it." Ethan felt something shift in that room, something fragile and monumental at once. For weeks this child had carried the weight of the world alone, and in one gentle affirmation, Clara had given her permission to set it down. Ranger exhaled a slow sigh, head settling back onto his paws as though the dog too felt the moment of release. Outside, the wind rattled the last dry leaves against the windows. Inside, in that modest room of brick and blinds, something like hope flickered quietly to life. The hospital in Pinewood sat on a rise at the edge of town, a squat structure of gray stone that had weathered decades of storms and still managed to stand with quiet dignity. Its windows reflected the pale sky, October clouds drifting heavy like wool across the horizon. Ethan Cole pushed open the double-glass doors, the blast of sterile warmth rushing over him, mingling with the faint smell of antiseptic and coffee. He guided Mika forward with a steady hand, Ranger at his heel, while Clara Jennings carried Noah wrapped in the faded blue blanket. Nurses behind the reception counter lifted their heads, their eyes following the sight of the small party with undisguised curiosity and concern. Mika walked stiffly, her small hand clenched in Ethan's. Her eyes darted over the gleaming floors and fluorescent lights, wide with fear. To her, the hospital was not a place of healing, but a place of strangers, and strangers meant danger. Ethan crouched briefly, his voice low, assuring her, "You'll stay with Noah. I promise." Ranger leaned into her side, a silent pillar of reassurance, and Mika's fingers instinctively curled in his fur. They were quickly led into a pediatric ward where a doctor waited, a man in his 50s named Dr. Harold Chen. His hair, streaked with silver, was cropped neatly, his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. Dr. Chen was the kind of man who carried calm like armor. Even the frantic cries of children seemed to soften when he entered a room. He listened carefully as Clara explained the situation, then examined Noah with professional hands, noting the labored breathing, the fever, the weakness. After several tense minutes, he exhaled and gave a small, encouraging nod. "He's sick, yes, but treatable. With antibiotics, fluids, and warmth, he should recover." Mika let out a gasp that trembled like broken glass, her shoulders sagging with relief. "So, he's going to be okay?" Dr. Chen smiled gently. "He will, thanks to you." The words seemed to stun her, as if no one had ever given her credit before. While Noah was prepared for admission, Ethan noticed Mika tugging at the straps of her tattered backpack. The bag was frayed, a zipper broken, but she held it as though it were treasure. "What do you have in there?" Ethan asked softly, crouching beside her. Mika hesitated, then pulled out a folded photograph, the edges worn and creased from countless touches. It was a family picture, faded with time, but still holding color. A young woman with dark hair and soft brown eyes stood smiling, her arm around a tall man with gentle features. Between them was a toddler with the unmistakable round cheeks of early childhood. Mika's face lit faintly as she whispered, "That's Mama. That's Daddy. That's me." Her small finger tapped the image, lingering with fragile reverence. Ethan studied the picture, something in his chest tightening. But it wasn't only the family that caught his eye. In the corner of the photograph, in a child's handwriting scrawled with blue crayon, were the words, "Mama's memory box under the big rock." Ethan frowned. "Mika, who wrote this?" She blinked at him. "Me. Mama told me to remember. She said if anything happened, I should keep this safe. The big rock outside town." Clara leaned in, her heart quickening. The detail wasn't random. For children in crisis, memory anchors like the big rock often pointed to something intentionally hidden. Clara's mind flashed to her own childhood, when she had kept scraps of paper under a floorboard at the orphanage, letters she wrote to a mother who never returned. She pressed a hand against the table, steadying herself. Ethan studied Mika, his thoughts heavy. This small clue suggested Elena, the mother, had left something behind. A lifeline, perhaps, or an explanation. He felt Ranger's head nudge his arm, pulling him from the storm of memory. The dog's amber eyes seemed to say, "Focus. The child needs you now." As Noah was settled into a hospital crib, his chest rising more evenly with each assisted breath, Mika sat beside him, refusing to leave his side. Ranger positioned himself at the foot of the bed like a guardian carved from shadow and light, his black and silver coat gleaming under fluorescent bulbs. Nurses passed by and smiled faintly, remarking how unusual it was for a dog to bring so much calm. Mika stroked his ears absent-mindedly, her small lips murmuring to him, as though Ranger alone understood the language of her fears. Ethan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching them. Something stirred uneasily inside him. For months, years even, he had moved through life with a hollow rhythm. Eat, work, sleep, patrol, avoiding attachment, avoiding reminders of what he had lost. But seeing Mika cradle Noah with fierce determination, hearing her whisper promises into the baby's ear, it cracked something within him. He remembered the night he lost his wife and daughter, how helpless he had felt, and how the universe had turned silent. Yet here was a child, younger than the daughter he'd buried, carrying hope like a shield in a world that had abandoned her. Clara's voice broke into his thoughts. She was standing near the doorway, arms folded around her folder, her face shadowed by memory. She noticed Ethan's expression, and for a moment, their eyes met. Two people who had been shaped by loss in different ways, now standing in the same room as a girl who refused to give in to despair. Clara cleared her throat, her voice steady. "If there's a memory box, we need to find it. It could explain why Elena left, and it might tell us who can take care of them now." Ethan nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, we'll go." His voice held the iron weight of decision. Hours passed, the hospital growing quieter as night pressed in against the windows. Mika eventually fell asleep in the chair beside Noah's bed, her small body curled, her hands still resting protectively on the crib's edge. Ranger lay stretched across the floor, eyes half closed, but ears flicking at every sound, as if guarding not only the children, but the fragile peace within the room. Ethan sat in the corner, watching them, the photograph still in his hand. He traced the faces in the picture with his eyes, lingering on the father's smile. Michael Thompson, he thought, a man who had left his children. But had he? Ethan's own grief whispered that sometimes absence was not cruelty, but collapse. Sometimes men broke. He knew, because he had nearly broken himself. Clara entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Ethan, her gaze settling on Mika. "She reminds me of myself," Clara murmured. "When I was her age, I thought I could protect my sister from everything. But love doesn't stop the world from hurting you. It just gives you a reason to keep standing." Her words hung heavy in the sterile air. Ethan looked down at the photograph again. The words scrawled in blue crayon seemed almost to echo in the room. Mama's memory box under the big rock. A whisper, a breadcrumb left in the dark. It was a thread they would have to follow, and Ethan knew instinctively that whatever lay inside that box could change everything. He tucked the photo carefully back into Mika's bag, his decision final. Tomorrow, they would search for the big rock. Tonight, they would watch over these children who had already carried the weight of worlds too heavy for their shoulders. And in the soft rhythm of Noah's breathing, Ethan thought he heard the faintest sound of possibility. Not salvation, not yet, but the first step toward it. The next morning dawned gray with clouds hanging low over the mountains like heavy curtains. A fine drizzle-coated pine wood, soft but insistent. The kind of rain that seeped into clothing and made the world feel muted and watchful. Ethan Cole tightened the collar of his patrol jacket as he guided the cruiser along the winding back roads that led out of town. Beside him sat Clara Jennings, her folder clutched against her chest as though it were armor, her hazel eyes scanning the fog-shrouded landscape. In the back seat, Mika sat with Noah curled against her, the infant bundled warmly in hospital blankets. Ranger lay stretched on the seat beside them, his black and silver fur damp with the morning mist, amber eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if he too understood the importance of the journey. The big rock was easy to find. Locals knew it as Boulder's Rest, a massive granite outcrop at the edge of the pine forest, standing like a silent sentinel over the valley. Generations of children had climbed it, painted initials on it, or hidden treasures beneath its roots. But today, it carried a weight that none of those children could have imagined. Ethan parked the car at the roadside, gravel crunching under the tires, and stepped out into the damp air. Mika's small hand immediately found his as she climbed down, her eyes wide as she looked toward the looming stone. "That's it," she whispered. "Mama told me." Her voice was soft, reverent, as if she were approaching a sacred place. Clara crouched beside her, brushing rain from her glasses. "Do you remember exactly where?" Mika pointed with trembling fingers to a patch of earth near the base, where pine needles and wet leaves clumped together. Ranger patted ahead, nose to the ground, sniffing with focus. The dog began to paw at a corner where the soil was looser, tail flicking in quick jerks. Ethan knelt and began to dig with his hands, cold mud coating his gloves. Within minutes, his fingers struck metal. He cleared the earth carefully, revealing a small tin box, dented and rusted at the edges, but still intact. He lifted it out slowly, as though it were fragile glass, and wiped away clinging mud. Mika's breath caught audibly, her entire body tense with hope and fear. Clara placed a steady hand on the child's shoulder. "Let's open it together," she suggested. They gathered beneath the shadow of the stone, while drizzle pattered around them. Ethan pried the lid open, the old hinge squealing. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with twine, a faded scarf folded neatly, and a small silver pendant shaped like a heart. Clara reached in with careful hands and lifted the letters, the paper soft with age but still legible. The first note, written in hurried but graceful handwriting, began with "My sweet Mika and baby Noah." Clara read aloud, her voice catching as the words unfolded. Elena Vasquez explained how she had left Pinewood not to abandon her children, but to find steady work in another state. She admitted she had asked their father, Michael, to care for them, believing he would manage while she built a foundation for their future. But her letters revealed worry. She knew Michael had been struggling since the death of his father, slipping into despair, drinking too much, unable to provide steady care. She had hidden the memory box so Mika would have proof that she had never intended to leave them forever. Mika pressed her face into the scarf, inhaling its lingering scent. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her eyes shone fiercely. "See? Mama didn't forget us," she whispered, clutching the pendant tightly in her fist. Ethan looked away briefly, his jaw tightening. The words on the page stirred a storm within him, because he recognized the fracture in Michael, the same fracture he himself had nearly succumbed to after his own loss. He had walked close to that same edge, and only Ranger's steady presence had kept him tethered. For the first time, Ethan felt not only anger at Michael's failure, but also an aching understanding. Clara, meanwhile, stared at the handwriting with a furrowed brow. Something about the name nagged at her. "Elena Vasquez," she murmured. "I know this name." She sifted through memory until it surfaced. Years earlier, Clara had volunteered with a small outreach program for struggling young mothers. Elena had been one of them, a quiet but determined woman who had attended 3 sessions before disappearing. Clara remembered the way Elena had held Mika, then only a toddler, her eyes full of equal parts love and desperation. Realization hit Clara like a stone to the chest. "I met your mother once," she told Mika softly. "She wanted to build a better life for you. She was trying, even then." Mika's eyes widened, her small lips parting. "You knew her?" Clara nodded, her own voice thick. "Yes, and I remember she never stopped talking about how much she loved you." The revelation anchored Mika in a way that words rarely could. For a child who had spent weeks fighting alone to keep her baby brother alive, hearing that her mother's love had never wavered was like opening a window in a locked room. She pressed the pendant to her chest and whispered, "I knew she loved us." Ranger let out a low bark, circling the group as though reminding them that time was still moving. Ethan carefully closed the box, returning the letters and scarf. He stood, his boots sinking slightly in the wet earth, and looked out across the valley where fog curled through the pines. His voice was rough when he spoke. "This changes things. We know Elena tried, and we know Michael is broken, but the kids, they can't wait for broken people to fix themselves. They need something now." Clara straightened, rain dripping from her hair. "They need family. We have Rosa's address. We have proof Elena left them with hope, not abandonment. That has to mean something in court." Her eyes flicked to Ethan's. "But if we're going to protect them, we have to act quickly. Systems move fast when children are involved." Ethan nodded, his jaw set. He reached down, brushing the mud from Mika's cheek with his thumb. "You're not alone anymore," he told her quietly. Ranger leaned his head against her small shoulder, as if sealing the promise. They returned to the cruiser, the tin box wrapped carefully in Clara's coat. The rain began to ease, streaks of pale sunlight breaking through the clouds in fragile shafts. As Ethan started the engine, he glanced into the rearview mirror. Mika sat with Noah cradled in her arms, the scarf draped across her lap, the pendant clutched in her small fist. Ranger pressed close beside her, his presence steady and immovable. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something shift inside him, a recognition that perhaps the world was not only filled with loss, but also with hidden treasures buried beneath stones, waiting to be uncovered. He did not know what the future would hold for Mika, Noah, or even for himself. But he knew this. They had found more than a box that day. They had found proof of love, proof that even in brokenness, family ties had not been severed. And that, he thought, as the rain gave way to light, was enough to keep moving forward. The drive back from Boulder's Rest was silent, the kind of silence that wasn't heavy but full of thought. Rain had stopped, though the windshield still glistened with beads of water. Pinewood lay quiet as always, a town tucked into mountains that seemed to brood over every house and every secret. In the back seat, Mika cradled Noah as if nothing in the world could come between them. The faded scarf lay over her lap, and in her hand she gripped the silver pendant from the memory box, so tightly her knuckles whitened. Ranger rested beside her, eyes half closed, though Ethan knew the German Shepherd was never truly asleep, always listening, always ready. Clara Jennings sat in the passenger seat, her phone resting in her palm. She had spent the last few hours debating whether to make the call. The letters in the box had given them a direction: Rosa Vasquez, Elena's sister, living in Arizona. Clara knew how complicated family connections could be. Some doors, once opened, could not be closed. But every glance at Mika's face, every stubborn flicker of hope in those dark eyes, told her that they owed the child a chance. Back at the station, Ethan parked, and they settled into a quiet office. The walls hummed with the old radiator, papers stacked in untidy piles on the desk. Mika sat on a chair too large for her, Noah sleeping fitfully against her chest. Ranger positioned himself at her feet like a living barrier between her and the uncertain world. Ethan leaned against the desk, arms folded, his presence steady but silent. Clara sat across from Mika, her phone now placed on the table. "Mika," she began gently, "do you remember your mama ever talking about her sister? Rosa?" Mika frowned, trying to recall. Then she nodded slowly. "Aunt Rosa. Mama said she lived where it's hot. She said Aunt Rosa was good at making clothes. She promised someday we'd visit." Clara smiled faintly. "That's right. She makes dresses, and we found her name and her address in your mama's box. We can call her if you'd like." At this, Mika's eyes widened, hope and fear warring inside her. "What if she doesn't remember me?" she whispered. "What if she doesn't want us?" Ethan crouched beside her, his voice deep and steady. "Sometimes family drifts apart, Mika, but blood remembers. And if she's anything like your mama, she will want you." Ranger nudged Mika's knee, amber eyes shining, as if agreeing with Ethan's words. Clara dialed. The phone rang once, twice, and then a woman's voice answered, accented with the warmth of the Southwest, low and a little breathless. "Hello?" Clara cleared her throat. "Rosa Vasquez?" "Yes, this is Rosa. My name is Clara Jennings. I work with Pinewood County Social Services. I'm calling about your sister's children." There was silence on the other end, the kind that stretches taut before breaking. When Rosa finally spoke, her voice trembled. "Mika!" Noah! Mika gasped and clutched the phone before Clara could stop her. Aunt Rosa? It's me, Mika! The words burst out in a rush, half sob, half laughter. Oh, my sweet girl. Rosa's voice broke into tears. I remember you. I remember the day you were born, with a head full of black hair just like your mama. I've prayed for you every night. Tell me you're safe. Mika's face crumpled with emotion. I tried, Aunt Rosa. I took care of Noah. I gave him food. I kept him dry when it rained. He was sick, but the doctor says he's getting better. I did everything Mama told me to. On the other end, Rosa was crying freely now. You are so brave, Mika. So strong. Your mama would be so proud of you. Can you put the phone near Noah? I want to hear him breathe. Mika giggled through her tears, the first genuine laugh Ethan had ever heard from her. She pressed the phone against the baby's ear. He can't talk yet, Aunt Rosa, but he can hear you. Rosa began to sing then, her voice trembling but steadying as the melody wove through the static of the line. A lullaby in Spanish, soft and lilting. The same song Elena had once sung to Mika as a baby. The sound filled the small office, wrapping around them like a blanket warmer than any scarf. Noah stirred, his tiny fingers curling, then relaxed against his sister's chest, soothed by the song. Mika's tears ran freely, but her smile glowed like sunrise. Ethan stood silently in the corner, the sound piercing something deep in him. He remembered nights of silence after his wife and daughter died, remembered wishing for a song to drive away the emptiness. Watching Mika's face light up, hearing Rosa's voice spill across states to reach them, he felt something shift, something thaw. Perhaps the world had not ended the night he thought it had. Perhaps there was still a thread of hope for families broken by grief. When the song ended, Rosa whispered, I want you here, Mika. Both of you. You have a home with me. I will come for you if I must. Clara's professional side cut in, though her voice was gentle. Rosa, we'll need to coordinate through the courts, but hearing you commit to them matters greatly. They need you. Rosa's voice firmed. Then I will do whatever is required. Paperwork, hearings, anything. Just don't let them be alone anymore. Mika pressed the pendant in her fist and whispered, We're not alone now. We have you. The line eventually disconnected, but the echo of Rosa's song lingered in the room like the faint warmth of a hearth. Mika sat straighter, her small face transformed by hope. She looked at Ranger and whispered, See, we're going to be okay. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. Ethan stepped outside afterward, needing air. The drizzle had stopped, and the town seemed brighter, as if the mountains had lifted their shoulders. He leaned against the brick wall, drawing a slow breath. Clara joined him, her eyes soft. That girl has carried the world, she murmured. But she hasn't lost her light. Ethan glanced down at Ranger, who leaned against his leg, and then back at Clara. I thought mine went out a long time ago, he admitted. His voice was low, almost lost in the wind. Clara studied him, recognizing the weight behind the words, but said nothing. She simply stood beside him, her presence steady, her silence a kind of understanding that words could not provide. Inside, Mika sang softly to Noah, repeating the lullaby she had just learned again, her small voice wavering but determined. It was imperfect, but it was love made audible. And as Ranger settled at her feet, Ethan realized he was not only guarding 2 children that day, he was also watching the fragile rebirth of something in himself he had thought long dead, faith in the possibility of healing. The rain returned the next day, steady and cold, drumming on the cruiser's roof as Ethan Cole steered through the outskirts of Pinewood. The windshield wipers kept time like a metronome, a rhythm that filled the silence inside the car. Clara Jennings sat in the passenger seat, her folder balanced on her lap, though she hadn't opened it once. Her eyes were fixed on the gray horizon, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Ranger lay in the back, head on his paws, amber eyes half closed but alert. In the far corner, Mika dozed lightly with Noah tucked against her, the silver pendant still clenched in her tiny fist even as she slept. They were headed to the shelter on Maple Avenue, a squat building wedged between an abandoned hardware store and a laundromat that smelled of bleach. The shelter was run by a church, its sign faded but still proclaiming Hope Center. Ethan parked and killed the engine. He lingered for a moment, staring through the rain-streaked windshield. "Are you ready?" Clara asked quietly. Ethan nodded, though his jaw tightened. Inside, the shelter was warm but worn. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the air carrying the smell of soup and damp clothing. A volunteer behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with tired kindness in her eyes, recognized Ethan immediately. "You're looking for Michael Thompson, aren't you?" she asked softly. Ethan gave a short nod. The woman gestured toward the far end of the hall, where rows of cots stretched beneath fluorescent glare. "He's here most afternoons, doesn't talk much, keeps to himself." Ethan and Clara walked together, Ranger padding silently beside them. When they reached the last row of cots, they found him. Michael Thompson was only 37, but grief had aged him into an old man's shadow. His frame was tall but bent, his beard unkempt, dark hair streaked prematurely with gray. His eyes, once gentle, judging by the photograph Mika had carried, were sunken, ringed with exhaustion. He sat hunched on the edge of the cot, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, staring at the floor as if it were the only world left. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his chest tightening at the sight. He knew this posture. He had lived it. It was the stance of a man who had lost too much and found himself unable to bear the weight of even the smallest things. Clara spoke first, her voice soft but steady. "Michael?" Michael's head jerked slightly, but he did not look up right away. When he finally did, his gaze was wary, like an animal cornered. His voice was rough from disuse. "Who are you?" Clara stepped forward, crouching so that her eyes were level with his. "My name is Clara Jennings. I'm a social worker with Pinewood County. This is Officer Ethan Cole. We've been caring for your children, Mika and Noah." At the mention of their names, Michael flinched. His hands clenched into fists around the blanket. His lips parted as though words might come, but nothing did. Ethan studied him, the recognition cutting deep. He saw himself the year after his wife and daughter's accident, silent, broken, unwilling to let anyone reach him. He cleared his throat. "They're alive and safe, but they've been through hell." Michael's head bowed, his shoulders heaving once. A broken sound escaped his throat. I couldn't. I wasn't strong enough. After Dad died, I lost the job, then the house. Elena left for work, and she thought I could handle it. But I couldn't even handle myself." He dragged a trembling hand across his face. "I meant to come back. Every day I thought, today. But the shame kept me here. Better gone than watching them see me like this." Ethan's fists tightened at his sides. For weeks, anger at Michael had burned inside him. Anger that a man could leave two children to fend for themselves. But standing here, seeing him hollowed out, Ethan felt something else. Recognition, painful and raw. He had nearly been this man. Had Ranger not forced him out of bed each morning, had duty not pulled him back into the world, he could have been the one lost on a cot, too ashamed to return. Clara's voice softened, but her eyes remained firm. "Michael, shame doesn't change what your children endured. Mika carried Noah on her chest through rain and hunger. She gave him food she found in trash bins. She begged strangers not to take him away. She's 6 years old. She became the parent because you disappeared." Michael sobbed into his hands. "I know. God, I know. And I don't deserve them back." Ranger moved then, padding forward until he stood in front of Michael. The dog's gaze was steady, unwavering, his body taut but calm. Michael lifted his head slowly, meeting those amber eyes. Something passed between man and animal, a silent judgment, but also a strange absolution. Ranger sat down heavily in front of him, exhaling in a sigh that seemed to say, "You failed, but you are not lost beyond redemption." Ethan crouched beside him. His voice was low, rough with old grief. "I buried my wife and daughter. I thought life ended that night. I almost gave up. If it weren't for Ranger here, I wouldn't be standing. So, don't think I don't understand. But listen carefully. Your children don't need you perfect. They just need you to stand up again. To try." Michael's eyes filled with tears. "How? After everything?" Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out the photograph Mika had carried. He placed it in Michael's shaking hands. "Because she still remembers you like this. Not the man on a cot, but the man who smiled at her in this picture. And she still loves you. That's enough to start. Michael clutched the photo to his chest, rocking forward. His sobs filled the shelter hall, echoing against the walls. Other men stirred on their cots but looked away, respecting the private collapse. Clara touched Ethan's, arm lightly, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude that he had spoken words she could not. When the storm of Michael's sobs subsided, Clara spoke again. You need help, Michael. Real help. Therapy, sobriety, counseling. If you want any chance of being part of Mika and Noah's life again, you must fight for it. Will you? Michael lifted his head, his face blotched with tears, but something flickered behind his brokenness. I will. If they can forgive me. If God can forgive me. I'll do whatever it takes. Ranger shifted closer, pressing his head against Michael's knee. Michael startled, then slowly laid a trembling hand on the dog's fur. His first touch of connection in months, maybe years. Ethan stood, his face unreadable, but inside, the ice that had long encased his grief cracked another inch. He had spent years despising weakness in himself, despising the part of him that had wanted to lie down and never rise. But now he saw that brokenness was not weakness. It was human, and standing here with Michael, he realized forgiveness might not only save this man, it might save Ethan too. As they left the shelter, Clara carrying the promise of paperwork and Michael clutching the photograph like a lifeline, Ethan looked back once. Michael was still seated, but straighter now, his hand buried in Ranger's fur, as though holding on to the last thread that tethered him to life. The rain had eased outside, the clouds parting to let in a thin, determined shaft of light. Ethan tilted his face upward, the cold drops mingling with something warmer on his cheek. He told himself it was only the rain. The courthouse in Pinewood was an old red brick structure built a century ago, its columns streaked with moss, its flag whipping restlessly against the iron sky. On the morning of the hearing, the town square bustled more than usual. Word had spread. A 6-year-old girl carrying her baby brother through the streets had ignited whispers, and those whispers had drawn reporters, their cameras perched like hungry birds waiting for tragedy or miracle. Inside, the air smelled of dust and varnish. Courtroom 2 was small but already crowded, rows of benches filled with townsfolk, journalists scribbling in pads, and a handful of strangers drawn by curiosity. Ethan Cole stood near the aisle in his Navy patrol coat, his shoulders squared, though inside he was taut with unease. Ranger lay at his feet, calm but alert, a sentinel who seemed out of place amid the polished wood and legal jargon. Clara Jennings sat beside Mika, who clutched Noah tightly, her small chin lifted though her eyes darted nervously. Judge Eleanor Whitmore presided, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a bun. Her reputation was one of fairness, but also of exacting standards. She adjusted her glasses, surveying the crowded room, and began. We are here today to determine the temporary placement of Mika and Noah Thompson, children of Michael Thompson and Elena Vasquez. The county attorney stood, a lean man with clipped speech. Your Honor, these children have endured abandonment. Their father is currently residing in a shelter, his stability questionable. Their mother left for another state, absent for weeks. The state argues that foster placement is in their best interest. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Mika's eyes widened, her small body stiffening. She buried her face briefly into Noah's hair, as though shielding him. Ethan's jaw clenched. He had heard the phrase best interest used countless times, but rarely had it sounded so detached, so blind to the truth he had witnessed. Clara rose. Her voice was steady, but the weight of her own memories pressed behind each word. Your Honor, with respect, these children are not without family. Their aunt, Rosa Vasquez, has come forward. She is prepared to assume temporary custody. She has a stable home in Arizona, steady employment, and an unbroken connection to Elena. She has expressed commitment to the children's welfare. Judge Whitmore adjusted her glasses, peering over the rim. Ms. Vasquez is not present. She is en route, Clara replied, her voice unwavering. We have spoken with her, verified her residence and employment. She has sworn she will assume guardianship if permitted. More importantly, she has already built trust with Mika, who has spoken with her directly. Mika looked up then, her lips trembling, but her voice breaking into the silence. Please, I want to stay with Aunt Rosa. I don't want to go to strangers. The room stilled. Even the reporters paused their scribbling, pens hovering. The child's plea carried more weight than any argument. Ethan bent to whisper to her, his tone low and protective. You're brave, Mika. Keep holding Noah. Don't be afraid. Ranger nudged her knee, his warm presence grounding her. The county attorney cleared his throat. Your Honor, with respect, we cannot base decisions on sentiment. We must consider the father's record of abandonment, the mother's absence, and the aunt's ability to provide across state lines. At the mention of abandonment, Ethan felt heat rise in his chest. He thought of Michael in the shelter, broken but not cruel, a man undone by grief. He wanted to shout that pain was not abandonment, that shame was not malice. But this was not his place. Clara's hand trembled as she held her folder. Memories flooded her. The day her mother left her at a bus station with a note pinned to her coat. The months in foster care. The revolving doors of strangers' homes. She steadied herself, speaking louder this time. With respect, I was a child in foster care. I know what it means to be shuffled between strangers. I know the scars it leaves. These children have endured enough. They need blood, they need family, they need the thread of continuity that Rosa offers. If we sever that, we risk breaking them beyond repair. Her words cracked something in the judge's stony expression. For a moment, Judge Whitmore's gaze softened. A door at the back opened then, and Rosa Vasquez entered, breathless from her journey, her black hair pinned hastily, her frame strong and upright despite exhaustion. She wore a plain blouse and skirt, a sewing kit strapped across her shoulder, a woman who worked with her hands, not her words. But when she reached Mika's bench, she dropped to her knees, tears streaming as she whispered, Mi niña. Mika let out a cry that split the room, clutching Noah and pressing against Rosa as though at last she had found safe harbor. Rosa cradled them both, murmuring in Spanish, words of love and promise. The courtroom, hardened by years of legal battles, seemed to hold its breath. Even the county attorney faltered, his notes forgotten. Judge Whitmore cleared her throat, visibly moved but regaining composure. Ms. Vasquez, are you prepared to assume full temporary custody of these children? Rosa lifted her chin, her voice clear. Yes, Your Honor, with all my heart, with all my strength. They will have a home. They will have love. The judge tapped her pen against the bench, her face unreadable. I will deliberate. She rose, signaling a recess, and the gavel struck once. As people filed out, Ethan watched Mika nestled against Rosa, Noah between them, and something inside him loosened. Perhaps the world was still cruel, but in this moment, love had spoken louder than law. Clara sat back heavily, her hands trembling, but for the first time in years, she felt she had spoken her own truth aloud. She glanced at Ethan. Their eyes met briefly, and in that shared silence was an understanding deeper than words. Both of them were no longer simply advocates for two children. They were participants in their healing. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, voices shouted questions, and headlines were already forming. 6-year-old pleads for family in court. But inside, in the quiet after the storm, hope had edged one step closer. The courtroom reconvened after recess, its atmosphere hushed but expectant. Judge Whitmore returned to the bench, her black robe sweeping as she took her seat, her gavel resting silently beside her hand. Outside, the storm clouds had shifted, letting in streaks of pale sunlight that cut through the windows and laid fractured beams across the wooden floor. The air was heavy with anticipation. Reporters sat forward, their pens poised. Townsfolk leaned in, whispering. And at the front row, 6-year-old Mika clutched Noah against her chest, her Aunt Rosa's arm encircling her like a shield. Ethan Cole stood off to the side, his broad frame tense. Ranger settled faithfully at his boots. The German shepherd's ears twitched at every shuffle, his amber eyes scanning the room with the calm authority only a dog could wield. Clara Jennings sat beside Mika, her folder of notes unopened, her hazel eyes fixed on the judge. She had argued cases before, but this time it wasn't policy or procedure that would sway the outcome. It was the fragile thread of love stretching across generations. Judge Whitmore adjusted her glasses. This court recognizes the gravity of the matter at hand. These children have endured abandonment, uncertainty, and hardship. The law demands we act in their best interest. Before I deliver a ruling, is there anything further to be said?" A hush fell. Clara shifted, ready to speak. But before she could, Mika stood. The room collectively gasped. The child was so small her head barely cleared the wooden table in front of her. But her chin was lifted. Her eyes, large and brown, gleamed with a mixture of fear and courage. She adjusted Noah in the blanket against her chest, tightening her grip on him, as though to remind herself why she stood. "Your Honor," Mika began, her voice thin but unwavering, "I'm only 6. I don't know big words, but I know my brother needs me. I kept him warm when it rained. I gave him food when I was hungry. I sang to him so he wouldn't cry. Please don't take him from me. Please don't make us go to strangers. We just want family. We just want love." The words sliced through the room like a bell tolling. Reporters froze, pens forgotten. The county attorney shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arguments shriveling in the face of a child's plea. Even Judge Whitmore's stern face softened. She pressed her lips together, her gaze dropping briefly to her papers before rising again. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He bowed his head slightly, murmuring a silent prayer, the first honest one he had managed in years. "God, if you're listening, give her what I couldn't give my own child. Don't let her carry this burden alone any longer." Ranger pressed gently against his leg, as though echoing the prayer with his silent presence. Rosa's tears fell freely as she wrapped her arm tighter around Mika, whispering, "Valiente, mi niña, so brave." Clara's hands trembled, memories of her own childhood slamming into her, but she forced herself to stay steady for Mika's sake. Judge Whitmore cleared her throat, blinking rapidly behind her glasses. "Miss Thompson," she said gently, "thank you for your words. They will not be forgotten." She turned her gaze toward Rosa. "Ms. Vasquez, do you reaffirm your commitment to temporary custody?" Rosa rose, her voice clear despite her tears. "Yes, Your Honor. With everything I am." The judge nodded once firmly. "Then it is the ruling of this court that Mika and Noah Thompson shall remain in the temporary custody of their aunt, Rosa Vasquez, for a period of 6 months. During this time, their father, Michael Thompson, shall undergo counseling and treatment. Their mother, Elena Vasquez, shall coordinate with this court regarding her employment and residence status. This arrangement ensures the children remain with family rather than strangers. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck. A sound of finality, but also of relief. The room erupted, reporters scribbling furiously, townsfolk murmuring, Rosa embracing Mika so tightly the child nearly vanished in her arms. Mika buried her face in Rosa's shoulder, her small sobs muffled but joyous. Noah stirred, cooing softly, as though even he understood something had shifted. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The tension in his chest eased, though his eyes stung with unshed tears. He knelt briefly to press a hand against Ranger's fur. "We did it, buddy," he whispered. Ranger wagged his tail once, his steady gaze fixed on Mika. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, her body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. For years she had carried the weight of being left behind as a child, scars she had buried under layers of professionalism. But today, watching Mika win back her right to family, Clara felt something heal in herself. As people began to file out of the courtroom, the chaos of media questions swirling, Ethan lingered near the doorway, his eyes fixed on Mika. She was smiling through tears, holding Noah and Rosa's hand, a fragile but undeniable picture of hope. He whispered another prayer, softer this time. "Thank you for letting me witness this, for reminding me families can survive, even when broken." Outside, the gray skies parted, letting a shaft of sunlight spill onto the courthouse steps. It gleamed against the wet pavement, lighting the way forward for a family that had nearly been torn apart, and for a man who had nearly forgotten how to believe. 6 months passed, and Pinewood shifted slowly from winter's grip to spring's bloom. The mountains that once pressed with cold now wore crowns of green, wildflowers pushing through soil still damp from melting snow. The town itself seemed brighter, as though time had brushed a layer of dust from its windows. For Mika, each day in Rosa's care had been a gift. The little house Rosa rented on the south edge of town was small but warm, with quilts Rosa had sewn herself draped over every chair, and the scent of fresh bread often drifting from the kitchen. Noah's cough had long disappeared, replaced by the cooing of a healthy infant who grew stronger with each sunrise. Mika, though still carrying the scars of those weeks on the streets, now laughed more easily, her small hands often tugging at Rosa's skirts as she helped with stitching, or held Noah steady while he tried to sit. Ethan Cole had watched from a distance, his patrols often circling past the house, Ranger trotting beside him. He did not intrude, but he found comfort in glimpses, Mika chasing bubbles in the yard, Rosa rocking Noah beneath the porch light, the family piecing itself back together with thread finer than law could dictate. Ethan himself had changed, though slowly. The weight of his grief had not vanished, but it had loosened its stranglehold. Each time he saw Mika's smile, it reminded him that brokenness did not have to mean the end. Clara Jennings visited often, not only in her professional capacity, but as a friend. She would sit with Rosa over cups of tea, sharing stories of their pasts, or teach Mika how to fold paper cranes, explaining that each bird was a prayer made visible. Mika would line them on the windowsill, insisting that they were sentries guarding Noah's sleep. For Clara, who had once believed she had been forgotten as a child, those visits were healing too. Michael Thompson's journey was harder. The court required him to attend therapy, parenting classes, and maintain sobriety. At first he stumbled, often calling Clara in desperation, ashamed at how far he had fallen. But with time, and with a determination that surprised even himself, he began to change. He found work again, repairing furniture at a local shop, his hands regaining purpose. Slowly, the hollow look in his eyes faded, replaced by something steadier. He wrote letters to Mika and Noah every week, though Rosa often kept them, until she felt he had earned the right to visit in person. And when at last he stood outside Rosa's door, his body straightened, his beard trimmed, his eyes clearer, Mika recognized him, not as the shadow she feared, but as the father from the photograph she still kept tucked beneath her pillow. Elena Vasquez returned from California 2 weeks before the court's review. She had saved enough money to finally stop running, to stand steady on her own 2 feet. The moment she stepped into Rosa's house, Mika flung herself into her arms, Noah squirming. Between them, and the sobs that filled the room, were a mixture of relief and grief. Elena promised through her tears that she had never stopped loving them, and Mika, clutching the silver pendant, whispered that she had always known. Now, on the morning of the final hearing, the courthouse looked different to Ethan. The air was not thick with dread, but touched by a fragile brightness. Reporters still lingered outside, their pens eager to close the story they had helped spread across headlines. The girl who saved her brother had become a phrase carried on tongues far beyond Pinewood. But inside, it was not spectacle. It was family. Judge Whitmore looked down from her bench, her expression softened by months of watching the case unfold. The court has reviewed all evidence, testimonies, and progress reports. It is clear that Mr. Thompson has committed himself to recovery and is fit to resume shared custody. Ms. Vasquez has demonstrated employment stability and commitment to her children. Ms. Rosa Vasquez has provided a safe and loving home throughout this process. It is the ruling of this court that Mika and Noah shall be returned to their parents, with continued support from their Aunt Rosa, who will remain a legal guardian and anchor for the family. The gavel struck, and the sound reverberated not with finality, but with release. Rosa wept openly, holding Mika, as Elena pressed Noah close. Michael stood awkwardly, his face streaming with tears, until Mika looked up at him and said softly, "Daddy, are you still sad?" Michael knelt, meeting her eyes. "I was, but I'm learning to be better, because you and Noah need me." Mika considered him, then reached out a small hand, placing it in his. "Then don't stop trying." Ethan turned away, blinking hard. Ranger pressed against his side, steady as always. Clara touched Ethan's arm, her own eyes shimmering. "This is what healing looks like," she whispered. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Afterward, the family gathered on the courthouse steps. The sun had broken fully through the clouds, spilling gold across the wet pavement. Reporters called out questions, cameras flashed, but none of it seemed to matter. What mattered was the sight of a little girl, her baby brother, her parents, and her aunt. No longer fractured pieces, but a whole, however imperfect. Mika turned suddenly, tugging on Ethan's coat. "Officer Ethan?" she asked. He crouched so their eyes met. "Thank you for finding us. If you hadn't, I don't know what would have happened." Ethan swallowed the ache in his chest, managing a rough smile. "You're the one who kept your brother alive, Mika. You're the bravest person I've ever met." Ranger nudged her hand, and Mika giggled, wrapping her thin arms around the dog's neck. As the family walked away, Ethan lingered on the steps. Clara stood beside him, the breeze lifting her hair. "You look lighter," she said, softly. Ethan gazed at the retreating figures, at Mika's small head pressed against her mother's shoulder, at Rosa's protective hand, at Michael walking straighter than he had in years. "Maybe I am," he murmured. "Maybe hope's been waiting all along." Ranger barked once, sharp and joyful, his tail wagging as though he too believed. Ethan crouched to scratch behind his ears, whispering, "We're still standing, buddy, and that's enough." Above them, the bell of the courthouse struck noon, its sound rolling out across Pinewood, echoing against the mountains. For once, the sound did not toll with weight, but with promise. Beneath the ashes of loss, light had returned, and with it, the certainty that even the most broken families could find their way home. In the end, this story reminds us that the hand of God often works quietly yet powerfully, through the bonds of love, faith, and courage. Just like the children and the German shepherd who saved a life against all odds, we too can witness small miracles in our daily lives, if only we choose to see them. Every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every tear turned into hope is proof that God's light still shines among us. So, let this story be a call for us to trust in His plan, to cherish those we love, and to never underestimate the miracles He places in our path. If this touched your heart, please share this video so that others may feel the same hope. Leave a comment to tell us what part of the story moved you most, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of faith and love. May God bless you and your family with peace, strength, and joy. And if you believe in the power of miracles, type Amen in the comments as a prayer of faith.